Good evening. Tonight we're starting with something quieter than our usual ride, quieter and stranger. The complete history of schizophrenia, a long, frequently sorrow-soaked record of minds that can feel split down the middle, as if reality itself has developed a seam. Forget the Hollywood cut. This is not a tidy, split personality thriller, not a romanticized spiral into madness with a neat third-act revelation. The real history is smeared with changing medical theories, moral judgments dressed up as science, fear that hardened into policy, compassion that sometimes arrived late, and countless ordinary lives that were misread and mishandled. To have lived through this in earlier centuries, honestly, physically, day after day, was exhausting. If you were dropped into a 19th century asylum or into a village that called your symptoms possession, your very first night wouldn't be cinematic. It would be a trial. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of long-form story you're here for. And in the comments, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is there. I never get tired of seeing how far this community stretches. Silence your notifications, take a slow breath, and let's begin. In the clay-dusted light of the first great cities, when the air still carried the smell of wet earth and baked bread, when gods were believed to pace the borders of every field, unusual minds made themselves known. Not as metaphors, as problems a community had to solve. In Mesopotamia, where scribes pressed reeds into soft tablets and kings carved law into stone, the work of answering those problems split into two professions. The ASU, the practical healer who mixed herbs and poultices, and the Ashipu, the ritual specialist who negotiated with what could not be seen. This wasn't a sentimental division. It was tactical. If a man shook with fever and his limbs jerked, the ASU took his pulse and reached for remedies, an emetic, a purge, something to move the body back toward balance. But if he sat alone and stared like he was listening to another city, if he spoke to emptiness, if he flinched at words no one else could hear, then the Ashipu read omens and recited incantations meant to drive out what the culture called demons. We can still see the evidence of that split laid out across museum shelves. Fragments of Sakiku and other diagnostic lists, receipts and prayers. The Maklu anti-witchcraft series, where you can almost hear the ritual drumbeat behind the scratch of the stylus. The community wanted answers in operational form. Is this illness an assault by a ghost, a curse set by a neighbor, or an imbalance that might be corrected with food, rest, and purgatives? The ancients weren't simply superstitious, they built systems. They invented paperwork for the human condition. Their cosmology had an internal logic. An evil presence might lodge in the heart or the head, sometimes with a name only a priest was permitted to write. And treatment meant logistics, organized labor, coordinated materials, scheduled acts. The priest wasn't only chanting, he was arranging incense and water, gathering exorcistic tools, directing the man who dug hot pits to cleanse a house. Healing was a communal project. The gods, if blamed, could be coaxed back into favor. The village financed rites. If the patient became dangerous, seclusion followed. Locked rooms, a bed in a temple wing, a caretaker paid in grain. The economy of care was public in one sense and painfully private in another. Illness could cost a family its harvest labor. In response, the community rationed support and restraint. Custody was practical, protect people and property, reduce disruption. And the idea that someone might hear voices was explained in the only languages available. The experience was slotted into ritual categories that carried real-world consequences. Who to call, which god to appease, how many sheep to sacrifice. Egypt looked different, but it performed the same function. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BCE, catalogues spells and potions with the same steady-handed detail Babylonian scribes applied to omens, remedies for nightmares, charms to settle a tormented mind, instructions that blend aromatics with spoken formulas. Egyptian healers worked in the house of life, where knowledge and ritual sat at the same table. A physician priest who applied a leech might pray at the bedside. Anatomically, Egyptian medicine famously minimized the brain and elevated the heart as the seat of thought. The mind and its wandering errors were tied to a worldview that placed moral order and social harmony at the center. Madness, to an Egyptian, wasn't only a problem of tissue or temperament. It was a disorder of household balance, of cosmic alignment. Their treatments were communal too: ritual and food, touch and steady presence, a priest or family member close enough to call the soul back toward conformity. Greece changed the terms without fully abandoning the old music. In the polis and in the sanctuaries of Asclepius, Epidaurus, and other sites where dream incubation promised sacred cures, the language of insanity slowly shifted. Demons didn't disappear, but natural reasoning pushed its way to the front. Hippocrates, living roughly in the late 5th and 4th centuries BCE, wasn't the lone genius later myth likes to crown. He stood inside a tradition and insisted that certain disorders, even those that produced visions and withdrawal, followed natural laws and could be observed. In On the Sacred Disease, he argued that epilepsy wasn't a divine visitation, but a disease of the brain. That single move loosened the god's grip on the clinician's job. Then came the rulebook that would dominate for centuries: humoral theory. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, an economy of fluids that gave physicians a template not just for diagnosis, but for care at scale. Black bile produced melancholia. Too much blood or too much air could produce mania and agitation. These weren't only metaphors, they were, in effect, a public health program. If melancholia sprang from a stubborn humor, the response was disciplined. Diet, exercise, bathing, bloodletting, fasting, sometimes relocation seaside air, or the quiet order of a temple. The attempt at cure required manpower, food, linens, a place. Often that place was the household. Sometimes it was a sanctuary. Clinical observation sharpened into craft. Aretaeus of Cappadocia, writing in the 1st or 2nd century CE, described withdrawal with a clinician's clarity. Patients who refused food, hid from company, spoke of agents and places that were not there. Galen later fused humoral theory with anatomy and temperament, mapping personality onto complexion and organ, imagining the brain and its fluids as a stage where reason and madness performed. And in practice, Greek medicine kept both halves of the older world, the ritual and the rationale. Dreams, divine signs, incubation rites, these stayed in the Asclepia alongside baths and prescribed regimens. Family and state bore the weight. The Greek city, with its temples and physicians, created a patchwork of remedies that worked as much through social organization as through medicine. That matters, because the ancient world was efficient with scarce resources. A city might support a physician or a priest, maybe both. Temple economies functioned as early hospitals. They took in the sick in exchange for offerings. When plague came, when famine hit, those same institutions expanded, turning storerooms into makeshift wards, pulling labor from temple farms. Madness was negotiated at the seam between sacred obligation and practical management. To watch the first patients in the historical record is to see people building infrastructure: roles, payments, rituals, hospital wings, record-keeping. They catalogued symptoms: withdrawal, hallucination, incoherence. So later generations could recognize patterns and, eventually, name them. The words survive, and with them the implied plan for care. When Rome's iron gates finally loosened and Western Europe slid into the long centuries we call medieval, some of those plans drifted, were reshaped, or survived in unexpected places. In Christian Europe, the language of spirit returned with force. People who might once have been tended in a temple were now often treated as souls at risk vessels, harassed by malicious powers. Exorcism revived an entire apparatus: clergy, relics, prayers, and legal processes defining who could be treated by the church and how. The church's moral authority meant that a man speaking to empty air might be called before a confessor as readily as a physician. And the cure of penitence was frequently about community order as much as bodily process. Monasteries and cathedral hospitals did take in the sick. They offered sanctuary, rhythm, prayer, and basic care. They also offered custody. Cloister life obedience, routine, silence could not be continuously disrupted. For families and local lords, placing a disturbed relative in a monastery cell or town hospital had the virtue of simplicity, danger contained, cost managed. Yet while Western Europe leaned toward holy explanation and containment, other regions were building structures that would quietly shape later medicine. In the Islamic world, especially from the 9th century onward, under Abbasid rule, Greek texts were preserved and reawakened. Baghdad's House of Wisdom acted like a translation engine. Galen and Hippocrates, rendered into Arabic, argued over, extended. The word bimaristan, place of the sick, began to mean something specific. Hospitals with wards and specialist practitioners. Physicians like Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, 854–925, wrote with an empirical hand. His clinical notes show a striking sensitivity to what we would now recognize as psychiatric phenomena. Careful distinctions between mania and melancholia. What today might be grouped under psychosis, practical guidance on restraint and comfort, and again a call for humane treatment. A century later, Avicenna placed mental disturbances inside a systematic medical framework in the canon of medicine. Obsessions, mania, melancholia, alongside regimens, baths, drugs, and the steady use of familiar dialogue. These physicians organized logistics like administrators. Wards were separated, attendants appointed, supplies tracked. Food, bedding, medicaments entered into hospital ledgers. Public and court hospitals in Baghdad, Damascus, and later Cairo set aside rooms for those the city didn't know how to hold. Patients were given occupations, gardens, crafts, repetitive work. Music and hygiene were used as therapies. Islamic hospitals were not only compassionate enclaves, they were administrative projects with staffing plans, stockpiles, budgets. In a sense, they were the medieval state's answer to a social problem. Minds gone astray. These parallel tracks mystical containment in Christian Europe on one side, sophisticated hospital-centered medicine in Islamic lands on the other set long-lasting patterns. Legal structures hardened around the choices communities made. Secular courts and ecclesiastical authorities both claimed jurisdiction. If a man could no longer manage his land, a feudal lord or the crown stepped in. If a woman's behavior scandalized a parish, church officials might demand an exorcism. The frameworks were local and patchwork, but they hammered in a principle that would never fully leave. The community had a stake. Responsibility meant power. Power meant records, property control, and often the authority to confine. By the year 1000 and onward, Europe knew the shape of institutions that sheltered and controlled, if not always cured. And the Islamic world knew the shape of hospitals that tried through organized clinical practice to cure. The long, slow thaw of the medieval mind began to quicken again in the later early modern period, when printing made doctrines contestable and centuries of cross-cultural contact returned more than spices. The Renaissance reintroduced classical skepticism into Western clinics. By the 18th century, the idea took hold that madness might be something the law could contain, and that enlightened medicine might, at least sometimes, treat. But the logistics of care were shifting right alongside philosophy. Cities swelled, economies industrialized, municipal governments acquired new responsibilities and new anxieties. If a temple or monastery could once absorb a handful of troubled souls, an exploding urban workforce forced institutional solutions on a different scale. England makes a useful arc to follow. What began as a medieval priory, founded in the mid-13th century, later became the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, eventually, with grim irony, shortened in popular speech to Bedlam. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, a recognizable pattern emerges. Private madhouses multiplied, city authorities worried about vagrancy and disorder, and the state began experimenting with regulation. The Madhouses Act of 1774, an early attempt to impose licensing and inspection on private institutions, recognized an uncomfortable reality. There were many providers and no consistent standards. The state's bureaucratic response forms, certificates, inspections was one of the first clumsy efforts to convert caregiving into governance. It was imperfect. It was also earnest in its own way. Paperwork was becoming policy. At the same time, a new moral imagination rose among reformers who believed that cruelty and chains were not only inhumane but counterproductive. In revolutionary Paris, Philippe Pinel, then a young physician, took a post at the Bicêtre, an old royal institution that housed soldiers, the poor, and the mentally disturbed. The story people love to tell is Pinel in 1793, striking off chains and walking among patients with a notebook. It's part legend and part history. Jean-Baptiste Poussin, the superintendent, had been unchaining patients before Pinel arrived. Pinel's role was in giving a humanitarian impulse a professional vocabulary, a theory of moral treatment that could be taught, repeated, and exported. Authorship aside, the effect mattered. Treatment organized around dignity, clean clothes, structured work, conversation, walking, predictable routines proved morally persuasive and practically manageable. Pinel's public acts and writings created a new rhetorical regime. To be civilized was to remove iron from human wrists. Jean-Étienne Dominique Esquirol, Pinel's student, turned that rhetoric into a professional taxonomy, distinguishing melancholia, mania, monomania, and various dementias. The hospital became a laboratory for classification as much as a place of refuge. Naming was not merely philosophical, it was administrative. A label could determine where a person slept, how they were managed, what a budget line might justify. In England, the Quaker William Tuke built another Model 1 that braided religion and practical management without chains. The York Retreat, established in 1796, was a small private asylum run according to Quaker principles of gentle persuasion. It had gardens, quiet rules, a structured program of work and social discipline. Its success, especially among middle-class patients, offered a template wealthy families could replicate and publicly funded agencies could try to scale. Across the Atlantic, an American reformer, Dorothea Dix, would in the 1830s and 1840s advocate fiercely for state-funded hospitals. She traveled the young nation, documenting conditions and persuading legislatures that humane institutions were a matter of Republican virtue. Her efforts helped drive the proliferation of state hospitals from the 1840s onward. But scaling ideals requires machinery. It demands an administrative imagination. How many beds? How many attendants? How do you feed hundreds of people whose labor no longer earns wages in the marketplace? How do you pay for heat, soap, and medical supplies through a long winter? How do you keep accounts for linens and medicines and repairs? How do you design a building that is breathable and bright instead of damp and punitive? In the United States, architecture became doctrine. Thomas Story Kirkbride proposed a plan in the 1850s. Long ventilated wings connected to a central administrative building, sunlight pouring into day rooms, gardens for walking, wards arranged to separate different categories of illness. The Kirkbride plan wasn't simply a building layout, it was a physical program. It assumed environment mattered, that large institutions could be constructed as therapeutic instruments. Those principles were translated into brick and mortar across the continent because administrators could see how to run them, how to staff the wards, how to place kitchens and laundries, how to receive supply wagons, how to make an asylum partly self-sufficient. Institutions devised work regimens, laundry, sewing, agriculture, not only to occupy patients, but to keep the place fed. The economic argument was powerful. An asylum that produced part of its own food reduced costs, and that cost-effectiveness justified public investment. Bureaucracy followed architecture. Lunacy commissions and boards officials, appointed by parliaments and state legislatures, translated moral sentiment into rules and registers. They required admission certificates, case histories, codified treatments, annual returns. Numbers became instruments of control. The patient became a record: name, age, diagnosis, occupation, next of kin. State of mind on admission, state of mind on discharge. Those registers allowed governments to count and justify budgets. They also allowed administrators to rationalize exclusion. Vagrancy, moral deviance, and poverty often slid conveniently under the umbrella of mental disorder. The moral fervor of founders collided with demographic reality. Cities overflowed. Industrialization tore families apart. Alcohol and urban poverty produced more people who frightened their neighbors. Institutions designed for humane care filled quickly, sometimes to twice their capacity. The ideal of moral treatment required low patient-to-staff ratios and individual attention. The reality was often the opposite: overcrowding, overworked attendants, and the slow bureaucratization of mercy. Professional psychiatry evolved on the same rails. In France, the term alienist captured the idea that the mind had become alienated from the self, and it announced a new specialist. France refined classification, England developed institutional guidelines, and German-speaking lands built hospitals and a clinical psychiatry that soon tried to subdivide mental illness by prognosis and pattern. Clinics collected case histories. Asylums became not only places of refuge, but research sites. Doctors recorded symptoms and outcomes and argued about causes. Melancholia versus mania, labor therapy versus hydrotherapy, music versus sedation. Expanding medical knowledge fed expanding institutions, and institutions fed medical knowledge, an intertwined industrial loop. That loop had a predictable dark side. Institutions require rules. Rules produce control. Control becomes its own end. Where a reformer once argued for conversation, routine, and dignity, administrations found it more practical to write rulebooks, secure wards, and routinize intake, especially of people too poor to resist. The medicalization of poverty, gender nonconformity, and political agitation found a convenient home behind asylum walls. Women who violated sexual or social norms could be confined with shocking ease. Dissidents described as unstable might be walled off. Laws that permitted guardianship for lunatics also permitted property transfers. Efficient, bureaucratically tidy, sometimes benevolent in intention, and often devastating in effect. The moral and the merciless braided together. Picture the logistics of a mid-century county asylum: minutes from board meetings debating expansions, contracts with builders, tenders for coal and blankets, a diet plan that fed inmates 3 times a day, a pharmacy ordering purgatives and tonics, staff schedules for physicians, matrons, attendants, cooks, clerks, maintenance crews repairing roofs and keeping laundry running, workshops where male patients tended gardens or built furniture under supervision, sewing rooms where women stitched linens. The ledger linked human beings to supply chains, and the ledger often determined survival. The county treasurer and parish boards became ultimate arbiters of how many warm blankets a person in melancholia received. As the state's responsibility widened, mental illness was reorganized into public infrastructure. By the late 19th century, the asylum had become many things at once: a physical form, a bureaucratic machine, a medical specialty, and a moral argument. That institutional moment matters because it nationalized custody and normalized categorization. The same institutions that offered warm beds and some therapies also produced the vocabulary that would steer 20th century diagnosis and tighten the medical gaze. They offered clinicians time to observe long courses of illness. They taught administrators how to manage populations. They trained legions of attendants in the rituals of control: seating, feeding, bathing, measuring behaviors, recording incidents in daybooks. There's an irony a bedtime historian can't resist saying softly: philanthropic and bureaucratic success expanding care also made these institutions vulnerable. The rush to build asylums in the 19th century solved a civic problem: where to put the unmanageable. But it also created a new apparatus of power with economies of scale. In small retreats, a doctor might sit with a patient and coax a return to habit. In an enormous county asylum, The approach inevitably involved rotating staff, standardized diets, and the economy of routine. Compassion in theory became tyranny in practice. Even when intentions were clean, the system's mass made gentleness difficult to sustain. Classification systems, once scholarly, became administrative instruments. Names like melancholia, mania, monomania, dementia mattered because budgets and space were allocated by diagnosis. The public demanded order. Administrators answered with categories. The result was an institutionalization of the mind, making certain states legible to power while rendering others invisible. A quiet psychotic break in a rural home might never enter the ledger. A public incident, someone shouting in a market, could produce a certificate, a wagon, a recorded entry, and a bed. That asymmetry is not clinical, it's political. If you listen to these centuries as one long, low song, you start to hear recurring themes. The attempt to name an experience, the attempt to allocate responsibility for it, and the attempt to design institutions that both soothe and contain. From Babylon's reed-scratched tablets to the prayerful hush of a medieval cloister. From Baghdad's learned wards to the airy pavilions of a Kirkbride asylum, societies built instruments for dealing with what they could not cure. Those instruments mirrored their time. Technology, theology, economy, the scale of commitment a community could afford. They also anticipated future science. A registry that recorded hallucinations and withdrawal became an archive. The archive became a data set for the next shift in thought, and throughout the human scenes repeat. A mother bringing a child who can no longer speak, a magistrate deciding whether to allocate a small stipend, an attendant learning a rulebook for calming an agitated person at night, quiet operations, kettles boiling, coal carts arriving in the morning, linen washed again and again. The extraordinary thing is not that it happened, it's that institutions wrote it down. Clerks recorded names and dates, physicians argued over causes and cures. State budgets paid to heat wards in winter. This is how societies convert mystery into policy. Slowly, through paper and coal and the steady wash of laundry. If antiquity set categories and the medieval period shaped much of the rhetoric, the 18th and 19th centuries built the institutional architecture and bureaucratic mechanics that would shape modern psychiatry. They made madness legible to administration and medicine. They also demonstrated a risk that has never left. When policy and compassion meet, policy tends to win over time. Moral treatment was a rare alignment of ethics and logistics. It required low census and high attention. When crowding came, the ethics frayed. That tension, humane aspiration versus the realities of running an institution, has haunted severe mental illness ever since. So the story through antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Enlightenment is not a steady march toward light. It's a choreography, spirits, humors, observation, each a language for making sense of rupture. Ritual and custody came first. Hospital wards and clinical observation followed. Medieval theologians and Islamic clinicians preserved knowledge in different tongues. Revolutionary and reformist zeal translated compassion into architecture and bookkeeping. Temples, cloisters, bimaristans, asylums. These weren't only buildings, they were social machines designed to hold and heal, to conceal and study. Inside their walls, we can trace the three tasks every society has always had to do at once. Name the problem, gather resources, decide who pays. Lay the story down in your mind like a slow clock. A scribe by lamplight, a priest in a temple, a physician taking notes, a Quaker arranging a garden, an administrator signing a requisition. Each gesture small, together they create the large, slow architecture of care. Because without the bed and blanket, the ledger and ward, the law and the lock, even the most humane theory remains a lonely argument in an empty room. And then, in late 19th century Germany, there was a man who treated disorder the way a cartographer treats a continent. He measured rivers, drew borders, and annotated what he could not yet name. Emil Kraepelin moved through Dorpat, Heidelberg, and Munich, between the 1880s and the 1910s, a man of tidy habits and sharp notebooks. He wore down pencils on admission forms and taught a generation of young physicians to look not at a single symptom, like a flower held up to the light, but at the whole garden over time, which plants endured, which withered, which returned each year to the same gate. If you could walk his clinics in the late 1890s and the first years of the new century, you'd see long corridors, enamel basins, casebooks lined like bank ledgers, and the quiet arithmetic of follow-up. Names and dates, persistent signs, outcomes. That was his daily bread. Kraepelin's insistence, and the quiet revolution he carried into practice, was that mental illness should be classified not by the theatrical features it displayed in a given hour, but by its course and its eventual outcome. Symptom snapshots could lie. The trajectory of a life was harder to fake. Over weeks, months, years, he gathered cases and watched them unfold. From that patient arithmetic, he drew two vast provinces. One he called dementia praecox, a label with predecessors, but sharpened in his hands into a specific box. An illness that began early and, in his observation, tended toward deterioration, a narrowing of capacities that looked like a premature dimming of the mind's lamp. The other province he charted was manic-depressive illness, episodic and recurring, yet often allowing recovery between storms. A landscape of peaks and valleys that could still leaf out again. This distinction, hammered into the textbooks he revised through the 1890s and into the early 20th century, was less a final theory than a scaffold. It shaped where research money went, where clinics were built, and how asylums recorded the histories of men and women arriving at their gates. Kraepelin was, in a quiet irony, both psychiatrist and bureaucrat. His method was systematic, his temperament classificatory. His conviction, biology cast the deepest shadow across mental life. He believed measuredly, firmly, that heredity and brain processes underlay the patterns he saw. He built institutions to study them. In Munich in 1917, he established what became the German Research Institute for Psychiatry, marrying clinical observation to laboratory hope. A modern science, he believed, had to be measurable and, above all, sortable. He argued explicitly and implicitly that if we could separate illnesses into reliable types, we could do more than comfort the anxious. We could study causes. We could find cures. The map dementia praecox versus manic-depressive illness became the working chart for a century of investigation. Neuropathologists searching for lesions, geneticists later compiling pedigrees, clinicians comparing prognosis. He wasn't wrong to insist that course and outcome mattered, but the trouble no mapmaker can escape is simple. Human minds do not always obey clean borders. Kraepelin's scaffold was necessary. It also hid parts of the landscape. Not far away in both geography and imagination, in the Swiss canton of Zurich at the turn of the century, another clinician was watching similar patients and asking a different question. Eugen Bleuler, who ran the Burg Hölzli Hospital from the late 1890s into the 1920s, did not accept Kraepelin's prognosis as a kind of sentence. He saw the same withdrawals, the same tangles of speech, the same private storms. But he resisted the idea that the story necessarily ended in a straight line of decline. In 1908, he introduced a new name, schizophrenia, a term he offered with careful technical intent. Not multiple personality, not the public's later fantasy of two people in one body. Bleuler meant something narrower and stranger, a splitting, a fragmentation of mental functions, a tearing of the seams that normally stitch thought, emotion, motivation, and perception into one cloth. His coinage came with a conceptual shift. Schizophrenia for Bleuler was not simply dementia that started too early. It was a disturbance of association, the loosening of the threads that bind ideas together, and a disruption of the inner architecture that keeps a mind oriented toward a shared world. Bleuler liked precision, but he also liked flexibility, and his writing reflects both. He distinguished what he believed to be primary symptoms, the fundamental intrapsychic disturbances, from accessory symptoms like hallucinations and delusions, which fascinated the public but could mislead the clinician if treated as the whole story. The accessory symptoms were loud, the primary ones were structural. His famous set association, affect, ambivalence, autism, was not a slogan so much as an attempt to point at the framework of disorder. Association, the weakening of logical bridges, producing the thought disorder clinicians recognized in speech that wandered like a river through marshland. Affect, blunted, flattened, or strangely mismatched emotion, facial expressions, and tone that no longer fit the moment as observers expect. Ambivalence, the capacity to hold opposing feelings toward the same person or object, maddening to families who needed a single clear reaction. Autism, not the modern developmental diagnosis, but Bleuler's older usage withdrawal into an inner life, a retreat from the shared world into private corridors. Bergholzli in Bleuler's day-tiled wards, boiled starch in the air, the quiet footsteps of attendants, was also an intellectual salon. Carl Jung worked there as an assistant and ran his word association experiments. Young physicians came to learn not only how to change sheets and tend bruises, but how to listen to disordered thought. Bleuler was sympathetic to emerging psychodynamic ideas without becoming captive to them. He allowed psychotherapy a role. He refused to speak as an executioner about prognosis. He hoped his new word would loosen the fatalism implied by dementia praecox and make room for variation for improvement, stabilization, and the uneven fact that lives do not always follow a textbook arc. Bleuler's move was decisive, and it carried consequences he could not fully control. When a physician in Zurich chose schizophrenia to emphasize fragmentation, the wider public heard split and imagined multiple people living inside one skull. The error was vivid, sticky, and durable. Newspapers and novels, later film scripts and jokes, turned a clinical metaphor into melodrama, a haunted house with several tenants, instead of one person whose inner integrative processes had come apart. Inside clinics, Bleuler's influence was quieter and more precise. He redirected clinical attention to the fabric of mental life to association, affect, motivation, teaching clinicians to look beyond the fireworks of hallucinations and notice the subtle distortions that often drive long-term disability. The tension between Kraepelin and Bleuler course and outcome versus fragmentation and process did not resolve cleanly. It became a dialectic shaping psychiatry for generations. On one side, the pull toward biological taxonomy grounded in prognosis and long-term course. On the other, the pull toward psychopathology, toward the internal mechanics of experience, meaning, and thought. Both insisted on different kinds of truth. Both were vulnerable to the pressures of their eras. Kraepelin leaned into the faith that disease maps would eventually be found in tissue and genes. Bleuler leaned into metaphor and paid the price when metaphor escaped the clinic and became public myth. Mid-century, as the world crawled out from wars and medicine, learned the languages of antibiotics and anesthesia, psychiatry made another attempt to find useful clinical anchors for psychosis, markers a busy clinician could use at the bedside. Enter Kurt Schneider, a German psychiatrist writing through the 1930s into the 1950s. Schneider did not deny complexity, but he wanted a practical standard. Which experiences, reported in a certain way, seemed most reliably associated with the diagnosis clinicians were calling schizophrenia? His answer became famous. The first-rank symptoms: hearing voices that comment on one's actions, or voices that speak to each other. The sensation that thoughts are being inserted into the mind from outside. The belief that one's thoughts are being broadcast audible to others. The feeling that one's will, impulses, or movements are controlled by external forces. These weren't meant as curiosities. Schneider elevated them because they felt to observers peculiarly characteristic signposts that, if present, tipped the diagnostic scales. Schneider offered a toolkit, conservative by necessity. The goal was shared language. Mid-century psychiatry, especially in North America and Northern Europe, wanted common words for common facts, so that schizophrenia in one hospital would mean roughly the same thing a continent away. And in the post-war era, such heuristics were welcomed with a kind of hungry reverence. Psychiatry wanted to be like other medical specialties: crisp categories, reliable signs, agreements that could travel. Then the field changed again, not because a philosopher won an argument, but because a drug changed the logistics of care. In the early 1950s, clinicians began reporting the calming effects of chlorpromazine. Within a few years, the first antipsychotics swept into wards and outpatient clinics and altered what was administratively possible. Long-term beds began to empty as medications reduced agitation and hallucinations for many patients. The policy currents shifted. New expectations and new budgets pulled toward deinstitutionalization. From the 1960s into the 1970s, psychiatry moved with the flow of policy and pharmacology, from institutions built like warehouses of chronic care into outpatient clinics, community programs, and halfway houses. That movement created a new hunger for administrative order. Insurance, hospital billing, government statistics, and drug trials all required agreement about who had what. Around the same time, another pressure cracked the profession's confidence. In 1973, David Rosenhan published On Being Sane in Insane Places, a now infamous paper describing healthy volunteers admitted to psychiatric hospitals after claiming auditory hallucinations. Once inside, they were labeled, interpreted through the lens of diagnosis, and struggled to be recognized as well. The study's thesis that psychiatric labels could be fragile and that institutions shaped perception provoked outrage, argument, and for many clinicians, a sickening recognition. Rosenhan wasn't the only prod. In 1970, Robbins and Goose argued psychiatry needed diagnostic validation anchored in family history, laboratory studies, and longitudinal course. In 1972, Feiner and colleagues published diagnostic criteria for psychiatric research short, practical operational definitions for depression, schizophrenia, and other disorders that could be used in studies. The mood became reformist and pragmatic. Diagnosis must be standardized, replicable, and sturdy enough to support clinical care and biomedical research. And then, in 1980, came the manual that reorganized American psychiatry's language, DSM-III. Under Robert Spitzer, a clinician with a fierce taste for checklists and field trials, DSM-III abandoned much of DSM-II's psychoanalytic tone and adopted operational criteria symptom lists, duration thresholds, exclusion rules, and a deliberate attempt to be theory-neutral about causes. Schizophrenia under DSM-III arrived with clearer boundaries, defined symptom clusters, required time courses, and explicit impairment. It was a manual written in the dialect of inter-rater reliability. Committees, data, and field trials promised that two clinicians in different cities could reach the same conclusion more often than in the amorphous past. Reliability became the talisman word. For better and worse, DSM-III traded some of psychiatry's messy, rich, inconsistent descriptive texture for reproducibility, something modern medicine prized. And the motivations weren't purely philosophical. Insurance needed codes, drug trials needed consistent inclusion criteria, researchers needed comparable populations to image brains, track outcomes, and later sequence genomes. Psychiatry, eager to be taken seriously by other specialties, wanted standards that looked like cardiology or oncology. The politics inside professional organizations were not immune to money and influence. Pharmaceutical firms, federal funding agencies, and professional ambition all tugged at the levers. Anti-psychiatry critiques, from philosophers like Thomas Sass to radical therapists and activists, had weakened psychiatry's public standing and pressed it toward defensible operational categories. And the trade-offs were predictable, reliability improved. But validity, the question of whether diagnostic categories map onto distinct biological entities, remained stubborn. DSM-III's schizophrenia became a useful clinical container. Persistent psychosis, lasting months, impairing social function. But inside that container lived a bewildering heterogeneity. Some patients responded well to antipsychotics and rebuilt functional lives. Others remained impaired, Some displayed mood symptoms that blurred boundaries and fed the already messy category of schizoaffective disorder. Some were primarily disorganized, others mainly paranoid. The grid allowed science to proceed while masking the possibility that the categories were partly administrative conveniences rather than natural kinds. Internationally, the World Health Organization's ICD series moved in parallel, not always in lockstep, but often with the same impulse towards standardization. By the early 1990s, when ICD-10 was widely adopted, many countries embraced diagnostic codes and operational rules that mirrored DSM's logic. The benefits were real. Multinational studies of schizophrenia's prevalence and course flourished. Large genetic consortia could assemble tens of thousands of cases because clinicians across nations could agree, more or less, on the name. But the very infrastructure that enabled coordinated research began to shape clinical practice. Treatment guidelines, formularies, training programs assumed a diagnostic certainty that was often more provisional than physicians wanted to admit. Schneider's first-rank symptoms survived into this era as part of the teaching lexicon: useful, memorable, tempting. Yet evidence complicated the story. Several first-rank experiences are not exclusive to schizophrenia. Thought insertion and running commentaries can occur in severe mood disorders and other psychotic states. The first-rank list was not a pathognomonic key. It was a set of signposts, helpful with nuance, misleading when treated as a litmus test. This is the neat cruelty of clinical tools. They work when used carefully and fail when treated as absolute. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, psychiatry found itself in a familiar conversation. Manuals had brought order, but not final truth. Biological markers had not matured into a simple blood test or imaging signature. Lived experience continued to refuse clean categorization. In response, new initiatives tried to rethink the basic terms of inquiry. In the United States, the NIMH introduced the Research Domain Criteria (RDoC) framework in the 2010s, aiming to study mental disorders across dimensions: cognitive control, reward systems, threat response, rather than as fixed DSM boxes. RDoC was research first and agnostic about bedside naming. It gestured back toward Kraepelin's hunger for biological grounding and forward toward mechanism-based science that might someday restore validity to categories reliability had formalized. Meanwhile, the DSM itself evolved. DSM-III's descendants refined criteria, removed subtypes, experimented with dimensional measures. DSM-V in 2013 removed the old schizophrenia subtypes: paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, acknowledging their poor reliability and limited utility. The manuals began to admit what clinicians had always known in their bones. Schizophrenia behaves like a spectrum heterogeneous individual, requiring careful assessment. And yet the manuals remain unavoidable. Insurance reimbursement, hospital admissions, research funding, regulatory approvals. Most roads still run on DSM and ICD pavement. The fact that they can be criticized for ossifying practice is also evidence of their power. The forces shaping diagnosis are rarely visible in ordinary clinical conversation, but they are always present. Psychiatric taxonomy isn't only the work of committees. It is the product of pharmaceutical companies funding trials, agencies deciding what will be reimbursed, activist movements fighting for or against psychiatric intervention, and researchers whose careers depend on homogeneous samples. Deinstitutionalization, managed care, global biomedical research, each pushed psychiatry toward categories that could be counted, coded, compared. These pressures produced benefits: access to medications, coordinated public health responses, a shared language for clinicians and researchers. They also created harms: over-reliance on checklists, the temptation to pathologize ordinary distress, the tendency to prioritize what's measurable over what's meaningful to someone sitting at a kitchen table trying to explain what it's like when reality slips. If you step back, the lineage from Kraepelin to Bleuler to Schneider to DSM-III and ICD is not a straight line. It's a braided rope. Kraepelin's emphasis on course and outcome gave structure. Bleuler reframed the problem toward fragmentation and psychic architecture. Schneider offered bedside signposts. DSM-III operationalized consensus and made bureaucracy and research possible at scale. Together, they built modern psychiatry. Together, they also made it partial. The same tools that enabled giant genome-wide association studies and multi-center imaging consortia can obscure the singularity of a life. Any clinician who has watched a manualized diagnosis fail to fit a human being knows the quiet irony. The category becomes both necessary and insufficient. And the word schizophrenia itself, chosen to honor a clinical observation of fragmentation, migrated into common speech, carrying the wrong image entirely. Split personality walked out of the clinic and into scripts and headlines. The clinical reality remained more complicated and far more human than the myth. So when we speak of a mind breaking in two, we have to remember the phrase contains more than one kind of break. A break between longitudinal observation and operational checklists. A break between clinical metaphor and public misunderstanding. And most painfully, the break many patients and families endure between the life they once knew and the one they must now navigate. An unasked for divide no manual can repair by itself. And yet quietly, there is resilience threaded through this history. The story of diagnosis is also the story of attempts, clumsy, sometimes inspired, to name suffering so it can be studied and relieved. If you imagine the whole thing as a parade of lights moving down a street from gas lamps in Dorpat to fluorescent panels in 1980s New York, each lamp illuminates a patch of pavement, and each casts shadows the next must address. Kraepelin set his lamp on course and outcome. Bleuler moved his toward fragmentation and association. Schneider placed his on certain luminous experiences. The manuals wired the street with dependable bulbs so carriages could travel without crashing. The light is imperfect, it has mattered. And the clinician's task, if we're honest, is to walk those lit streets with humility, to know categories are tools, not final truths, and with the courage to keep listening beyond checkboxes, to loosened associations, blunted affect, the faint commentary of a voice, and the long arc of a life that refuses to be captured completely by any form. There's a dark humor in how psychiatry trades metaphors and still returns to the same stubborn mystery. How to bring structure to a life that has become disordered. Committees, clinics, institutes, forms. Each is an attempt to name chaos so it can be managed, with the quiet hope that naming will lead to fixing. It has never been that simple. Still, each step Kraepelin's patient almanac, Bleuler's shifts of emphasis, Schneider's bedside heuristics, the manual's attempts at consensus has been a strategy for moving forward, a logistical response to suffering at enormous scale. And this history is not a triumphal march, it's a long experiment in care, classification, and the stubborn desire to understand how a mind can come apart, and how, with enough gentleness and persistence, a world might learn to help sew it back together. In the hushed corridors of interwar and early post-war hospitals, linoleum shining under electric lights, the night marked by the soft click of a nurse's watch and the distant groan of a radiator psychiatry turned toward the body as if it were a machine. Pressure came from overflowing wards, from families who had sat for years beside locked doors, from clinicians trained in anatomy and physiology who watched psychoanalytic theory ask for time while people continued to unravel. The therapies that emerged, insulin comas, chemically induced convulsions, electrically produced seizures, and most dramatically, the surgical severing of frontal lobes, were born of urgency and a faith in somatic intervention that ran ahead of evidence. They were offered not as whispers, but as announcements. Here is a tool. Here is a reset. The tools were blunt, the hopes were bright. And the first of these blunt hopes arrived like an endocrine whisper, turned into a hammer insulin coma therapy. Insulin coma therapy arrived first, like an endocrine idea turned into a ritualized hammer. In Vienna between the wars, Manfred Sackel, a Polish-born physician working in neuropsychiatric wards, began experimenting with high doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemic comas in people diagnosed with schizophrenia and other severe mental states. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, the practice spread outward from Viennese hospitals into Germany, Britain, and the United States, carried by case reports, professional curiosity, and the desperate hunger for something that looked like an intervention. The daily choreography had a theatrical quiet to it. An early morning syringe, a patient sinking into stupor, a ward watching for shallow breath. Then the deliberate reversal glucose brought like a lifeline. Nurses trained to read the signs of coma and recovery with the attentiveness of midwives. The staff learned the rhythm of revival the way a team learns a song: when to wait, when to act, when to fear. And there were stories, always stories, that moved administrators to allocate beds and families to sign reluctant consent. Reports of catatonia softened. People who had refused food began to eat. Patients woke from muteness into speech. Moments of lucidity and calm were held up as proof that the brain could be reset, rebooted, coaxed back into alignment. For a time, it was persuasive, but the promise was braided to danger. Hypoglycemia is merciless. Prolonged comas damaged brain tissue. Aspiration pneumonia stole breath. Convulsions, sometimes part of the cascade, produced fractures. Deaths slid quietly into ledgers as complications. Insulin coma therapy demanded labor and resources. Daily sessions for weeks. Attendants trained to manage collapse and recovery. Supplies of insulin and glucose. Rooms padded for safety. Wards reorganized around the treatment schedule. By mid-century, as other options arrived and better controlled evaluations took shape, insulin coma therapy dwindled. In retrospect, it was increasingly judged no more effective than prolonged supportive care, while carrying far greater risk. Looking back now, one can see the gesture clearly: the desire to reset the mind the way you might reboot a temperamental radio. Elegant as metaphor, crude in practice. The endocrine theory behind it: something in the body's chemistry might be jolted into stability, fit the era's appetite for somatic explanations. It also revealed how readily the body could be invaded in the name of cure. Not far from Vienna, another somatic faith gathered around seizures. In Budapest in the early 1930s, Ladislas von Meduna believed he had noticed an inverse relationship. Epilepsy and schizophrenia seemed to rarely coexist. From that observation, part epidemiology, part intuition, he hypothesized that inducing seizures might treat psychosis. He experimented first with camphor and then with the convulsant cardiazol, metrazole, developing convulsive therapy in the mid-1930s. The seizures were violent. The scenes in those wards were not tidy. Fractures were recorded. Terror was recorded to patients, anticipating the next session with dread. Yet some people calmed afterward. The field took notice because even ambiguous improvements looked like light when the alternatives were long-term deterioration behind locked doors. Then, in Rome in 1938, Ugo Celletti and Lucio Bini introduced electroconvulsive therapy. Electricity promised control where chemical convulsants had been chaotic. Celletti, famously influenced by watching pigs stunned into seizures in a municipal slaughterhouse, developed the idea that an electrical pulse could be delivered. The seizure harnessed, timed, and ended. The image is unsettling in its simplicity. A physician adjusting dials, a patient's brow tightening, a controlled fit, staff waiting for the hush after the storm. ECT spread quickly. Administrators liked that it required no complicated medication supply chain. Physicians liked its immediacy. Families liked that something could be done now. Not in months, not after years of talk. ECT proved especially effective for catatonia and for severe depression with suicidal risk. In those cases, it offered dramatic relief, allowing people to eat again, to dress again, to return from rigid silence. Small mercies, yes, yet mercies that translated into massive human and administrative wins. But the harms were never trivial. Early ECT was often done without anesthesia and without muscle relaxants. Fractures, bruising, torn muscles. These were part of the record. Memory loss haunted many patients, retrograde amnesia that erased chunks of life, a fog that stole time. Later refinements, beginning in the 1950s, introduced anesthesia and Curare-like muscle relaxants, turning a rough shove into a more careful nudge. These technical improvements reduced physical injury. They did not erase the ethical questions. Consent was often messy in wards where decision-making capacity was contested and institutional pressure was real. The electric machine, whatever its clinical value, became a symbol of psychiatric power, especially when wielded without patient voice. Films, courtroom dramas, and political rhetoric used ECT as shorthand for coercion, even as it continued to save lives in carefully selected cases. The history refuses to be tidy. A therapy can be both life-saving and frightening, and our judgments about it track social context as much as outcome data. Where electricity offered a controlled convulsion, surgery offered a different promise entirely. Cut, and the mind will mend. In Lisbon in 1935, Antonio Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist and statesman, began performing prefrontal leucotomies. He believed the frontal lobes were central to the circuitry of intractable mental illness. Using a tool he called a leucotomy, he severed white matter tracts in the prefrontal cortex and reported behavioral calming in some severe cases. In 1949, Moniz received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, an award that would later become a lightning rod for controversy as fuller outcomes and harms accumulated across countries and decades. In the United States, Moniz's idea was adapted with American speed and American confidence. Walter Freeman and James W. Watts began performing prefrontal lobotomies in the late 1930s. Freeman, charismatic, showman-like, refined the operation into a transorbital technique in the 1940s. The so-called ice pick lobotomy, performed by inserting an instrument through the eye socket and sweeping it to sever frontal connections. He demonstrated how fast it could be. A tool, a hammer, a ward, a procedure done at the bedside. Freeman toured, trained others, and the numbers rose. Tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed worldwide, in the United States, Britain, Scandinavia, and elsewhere, embraced by desperate families, by physicians pressed for quick results, and by institutions eager to quiet wards and reduce costs. One of the most infamous American cases was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, who underwent lobotomy in 1941 and emerged profoundly disabled. Public attention flared around such stories from time to time, yet for years the lure of a surgical cure outweighed caution, because wards were full and suffering had no simple answer. The harms were profound and varied. Some patients did become calmer. Too often they became flat apathetic, diminished, radically altered in personality. Seizures, incontinence, intellectual dulling, and death appeared in the record. By the time antipsychotic drugs swept through psychiatric wards in the 1950s, lobotomy was already losing prestige. By the 1960s and 1970s, as ethics tightened and less invasive tools took over, the procedure fell into disgrace. The Nobel Prize to Moniz, viewed through later decades, became a symbol of an era's desperation and the limits of its evidence. What unites these somatic experiments isn't merely method, it's assumption that severe mental illness was fundamentally a disorder of the brain that could be reset, recharged, or surgically repaired. Insulin coma leaned on endocrine speculation. Convulsive therapies leaned on an observed relationship between epilepsy and psychosis. ECT leaned on the therapeutic potential of induced seizure. Lobotomy leaned on early localizationist ideas about the frontal lobes as the seat of the self. Each had a kernel of observation and a blanket of speculation. Each produced impressions that felt immediate, sometimes helpful, sometimes spectacular, often ambiguous. Each left behind harms that would be debated in journals and courtrooms and family conversations for decades. Public trust in psychiatry swelled when hospitals reported calmer wards and families saw loved ones return from locked silence. That trust thinned as stories of blunted emotion, lost memory, and unconsented procedures spread. Ethics would be written not only by philosophers, but by law, policy, and patient movements demanding voice. And then the pill. It arrived not with surgical force, but with the quiet shock of pharmacology. A small pale tablet offering a different kind of reset. The story runs through France. In the early 1950s, a chemist at Rhône-Poulenc, Paul Charpentier, synthesized chlorpromazine. A surgeon and anesthesiologist, Henri Laborie, noticed its calming, anti-emetic, lytic properties in 1950-1951, using it in surgical settings to blunt shock. Psychiatrists took notice. In 1952, clinicians at Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris-Jean Delay, and Pierre Dennecker among them, reported that the drug quieted psychosis. Agitation eased, hallucinations diminished, a manageable calm settled in. In 1954, chlorpromazine was marketed in the United States as Thorazine. The word miracle slid quickly into professional and public talk, because for the first time, many people who had been long-term residents of hospitals could be stabilized enough to imagine discharge. Administrators counted beds freed. Governments saw budgets that might shrink. Families dared to hope. It was a social transformation as much as a clinical one. The pharmacological story braided into neurochemistry. Over the 1950s and 1960s, work by neuroscientists including Arvid Carlsson illuminated dopamine's role in the central nervous system. Later research connected antipsychotic efficacy to blockade at dopamine D2 receptors, feeding the dopamine hypothesis. Mesolimbic dopamine hyperactivity contributing to positive symptoms. Soon new drugs arrived. Haloperidol, developed in 1958 by Paul Janssen's group, became a prototypical typical antipsychotic. These medications were potent and effective for many, but their price was often written on the body. Acute dystonia, Parkinsonian symptoms, akathisia, and most tragically tardive dyskinesia, an often irreversible movement disorder after long exposure. The 1960s and 1970s carried both optimism and caution. Clozapine, discovered in the late 1950s and introduced in parts of Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, proved uniquely effective for some people who didn't respond to other drugs. Then reports of a granulocytosis dangerous collapse of white blood cells led to market withdrawals and strict monitoring where it remained available. Clozapine's story became a capsule of psychiatry's ambivalence, a transformative medicine demanding vigilant oversight. The United States approved clozapine in 1989 with mandated blood monitoring, a kind of pharmacological compromise between risk and necessity. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a wave of so-called atypical antipsychotics, risperidone, olanzapine, quetiapine, and others, arrived with a hopeful narrative. Similar efficacy with fewer extrapyramidal side effects, perhaps more benefit for negative symptoms and cognition. Marketing loved the story. The reality was more complicated. Atypicals often traded movement disorders for metabolic burden, weight gain, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, cardiovascular risk. For some, these long-term consequences shortened life, and even when positive symptoms improved, many people continued to struggle with negative symptoms, flat affect, anhedonia, social withdrawal, and cognitive impairment, domains where medication has proven stubbornly less effective. Pharmacology changed not only symptom control, but institutional policy and social expectation. Drugs made shorter hospital stays feasible and fed a belief that medication alone could return people to work, family, and citizenship. Policymakers used the drug era to justify closing beds. Pharmaceutical companies helped shape public narratives of recovery through advertising and continuing education. Yet medication alone rarely resolves the social and economic realities that shape long-term disability. For some institutions, drugs became chemical restraints. For some families, they were the only practical foothold. In aggregate, psychiatry's self-image shifted from asylum keeper and analyst toward prescriber and neuroscientist. That shift brought genuine progress and introduced new harms. Side effects, over-reliance on medication, the medicalization of suffering. If medication promised liberation from locked wards, the policy era that followed required something far more difficult than a pill: a social architecture. Deinstitutionalization, the deliberate move away from large psychiatric hospitals toward community-based care, accelerated from the 1950s through the 1970s and beyond. In the United States, the Community Mental Health Centers Act of 1963, championed by President John F. Kennedy, pledged federal funds to create local centers for outpatient care, day treatment, rehabilitation. The goal sounded modern and humane: close custodial institutions, and replace them with networks of community services. California's Lanterman-Petrus Short Act of 1967 curtailed indefinite civil commitment, seeking to protect civil liberties through due process and stricter standards for involuntary detention. In Britain, reform signaled movement away from custodial models. In Italy, Franco Basaglia led a radical anti-asylum movement. Law 180 in 1978 initiated the closure of large psychiatric hospitals and reframed care toward community services. The promise was elegant. With medication, housing, employment supports, and local clinics, people could live outside institutions and reclaim their roles. The practice was patchier. Many of the promised community services were never funded at the scale needed. Budgets favored bed closures and savings, while new supports arrived late, understaffed, and uneven. In the gap between discharge and functioning services, many people fell. This is where transinstitutionalization entered the record. People did not move neatly into supported housing. Many moved into jails, shelters, and nursing homes, institutions poorly equipped for long-term psychiatric disability. Jails became de facto mental health facilities. City streets displayed visible populations of people living with untreated psychosis. Families who once visited relatives behind hospital walls now managed crises in living rooms, emergency rooms, and courthouse corridors. The rhetoric of liberation collided with the reality that freedom without resources is often freedom to fall. Where systems invested, better stories emerged. In the 1970s, assertive community treatment, ACT, developed from the blunt recognition that some people needed multidisciplinary teams: psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, vocational specialists who would go to the person, not wait for the person to come to the clinic. ACT reduced hospitalization and improved housing stability where properly resourced. Supported employment models, especially individual placement and support, IPS, offered practical routes back into work through rapid placement and on-the-job support. These programs repeatedly outperformed older, train first, then work, vocational approaches. Early intervention in psychosis, pioneered in the 1990s by clinicians like Patrick McGorry in Australia, with programs such as EPIC in Melbourne, reframed psychosis as time-sensitive. Intervene early after a first episode, and long-term disability can be reduced. The model combined quick access to medication, psychotherapy, family support, and vocational assistance, and it spread globally through the 2000s. For chronic homelessness, housing-first models, famously advanced by Pathways to Housing in New York, showed that stable housing without preconditions improved retention and allowed service engagement on humane terms. These successes share a plain lesson: medication alone is not enough. When antipsychotics are integrated into housing, employment, family work, and early engagement, relapse drops and social functioning improves. When funding is insufficient, the closure of hospitals merely displaces suffering. Deinstitutionalization, then, is both a story of neglected opportunity and a story of bright ideas implemented cheaply. It succeeded where investment matched rhetoric and failed where budgets did not. The arc from somatic experiments to pills to community care is more than chronology. It is a series of shifting assumptions about what mental illness is and what society will tolerate in attempting to control it. In the 1930s and 1940s, psychiatry used bold interventions, often irreversible, believing biology could be coerced into compliance. In the 1950s and 1960s, pharmacology promised more reversible manipulation. In policy debates from the 1960s onward, politicians and clinicians imagined a community architecture around medication that was never fully built. Communities became the testbed for whether medical progress could become social recovery. Trust in psychiatry rose and fell with each chapter. A pill that quieted voices inspired gratitude. A lobotomy that flattened a person's vitality inspired horror. ECT could look like rescue in one context and coercion in another. The profession's authority expanded with biomedical science and contracted under the weight of abuses and failed promises. And through all of it, a quieter wisdom accumulated. Risks must be weighed with sophistication, evidence must be matched with ethics, systems must be built, not merely declared. The story continues through genes, circuits, culture wars, stigma, recovery models, and the modern fight over rights and coercion. But the pattern remains recognizable. Every new tool changes not only symptoms, but the moral and administrative landscape in which a person must live. The story of genes and circuits, like so many scientific romances, began with twins in clinics, with adoption files in registry cabinets, and with a blunt question researchers could not stop asking: how much of this runs through blood and how much through life? In the mid-20th century, a wave of studies tried to separate heredity from upbringing with the only tools available at the time: careful sampling, patient follow-up, and the quiet mathematics of risk. In Denmark, Seymour Keaty's adoption studies in the 1960s opened a door that never fully shut. Children born to parents with schizophrenia carried elevated risk, even when raised in other families. In the United States, related adoption work echoed the finding: heredity mattered. Then Irving Gottesman, with meticulous twin studies through the 1960s and 1970s, helped turn pedigrees into a strong argument for genetic influence. The shorthand that filtered into textbooks was high heritability, though the reality was always more weather map than fraction, a shifting distribution of vulnerability rather than a fixed number carved into stone. By the late 20th century, few doubted genes were major partners in this story, but genes were not gospel gods. The first genomic age brought a new, sobering humility. The single schizophrenia gene of simpler narratives did not appear like a jewel in a mine. Instead, the architecture that emerged was complicated and strangely democratic. Hundreds, then thousands, of common variants, each contributing a tiny nudge of risk. Rare copy number variants acting like storms in a small number of lives, and very rare private mutations that became famous because they were dramatic, not because they were typical. One of the most mythologized examples was a translocation in a Scottish pedigree that disrupted a gene later labeled DISC1, disrupted in schizophrenia 1. It sparked both hope and confusion, a bright flare that illuminated pathways without yielding a simple clinical lever. Large collaborations arrived because the problem demanded scale. The Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, a global effort, reported in 2014 that 108 loci were associated with schizophrenia. As sample sizes grew, more loci followed. The result was not the comfort of a single culprit, but the recognition of a dispersed chorus. Many genes, many pathways, each whispering rather than shouting. Some signals carried clinical drama. The 22q11.2 deletion, associated with DiGeorge-Guatra velocardiofacial syndrome, confers a far higher relative risk for psychosis than most variants. In a minority of people, it is a loud genetic event. But even here, destiny is not guaranteed. Risk is not fate. Out of this complexity came a tool that sounded seductive in concept: the polygenic risk score, an attempt to compress thousands of small genetic effects into a single number. For a moment, the promise glittered. Maybe genetics could guide prevention. Maybe we could see risk early, intervene early, spare lives the full collapse. Then the sober reality cooled the excitement. Polygenic scores explained only a modest portion of liability in the populations in which they were developed. Their predictive power weakened across ancestry groups. They became useful research instruments, ways to study biology, compare cohorts, probe pathways, but they did not become clinical crystal balls. They could say, probabilistically, that risk is elevated. They could not tell a family whether a loved one would develop psychosis, nor predict the course of a single life. The ethical hazard was immediate and obvious. What do you do with probabilistic information when you can't offer a clear preventive remedy? How do you avoid turning risk into stigma or probability into discrimination? The field learned to speak in cautious verbs. May, could, suggests. Necessary, perhaps. Sufficient, no. While genetics offered a dispersed map of vulnerability, brain imaging offered a different kind of map. Structure, activity, connection. The early images were stark and simple, and that simplicity was part of their power. In the 1970s and 1980s, CT scans showing enlarged ventricles entered psychiatric discourse like evidence in a courtroom, white slices that made the invisible feel visible. Later MRI work pointed towards subtle differences in cortical volume and thickness. In functional studies, researchers described hypofrontality-reduced activity in prefrontal regions, fitting clinical impressions of impairment in planning, motivation, and organization. As technology matured through the 1990s and 2000s, the picture became less dramatic and more diffuse. Small but replicable reductions in gray matter volume in frontal and temporal cortices, changes in the hippocampus, microstructural differences in white matter tracts on diffusion imaging. Not a single lesion, not a clean scar you could point to and declare, here, this is the disease. Instead, it began to look like wiring. In the language of connectivity, a conceptual shift emerged. Schizophrenia as a disorder of coordination, a problem of conversation between regions. Theorists, including Carl Friston, articulated disconnectivity models, faulty predictive processing, disrupted integration, circuits that fail to dampen or confirm sensory input the way they should. Functional MRI and resting state analyses showed altered network behavior across cohorts, with patterns in frontotemporal communication and default mode network dynamics. The phenomenon that haunts so many lives, auditory verbal hallucinations, could be correlated with hyperactivity in auditory cortex and altered monitoring of internal speech. The finding was both clarifying and unsettling. What once sounded supernatural could be reframed as mechanistic, as self-generated speech mistagged as external. A terrifying elegance. Biochemistry added another layer, and here the oldest modern story is dopamine. Chlorpromazine's effects, discovered in the early 1950s and followed by a generation of dopamine-blocking drugs, helped cement the dopamine hypothesis. In the 1960s and 1970s, researchers linked antipsychotic potency to D2 receptor affinity. In the 21st century, PET studies refined the tale rather than discarding it. Elevated presynaptic dopamine synthesis capacity in parts of the striatum in people with first episode psychosis and in some high-risk states. The modern version is not a simple, too much dopamine everywhere story. It is regional imbalance, subcortical dopamine dysregulation linked to psychosis, alongside cortical changes linked to cognitive deficit. And in 2003, Kshitij Kapoor's concept of aberrant salience offered a bridge between molecules and lived experience. Dopamine, in this view, tags stimuli as important. When that tagging system misfires, the world becomes loaded with false significance. A glance, a radio song, a passing car, ordinary events begin to glow with threatening meaning. Delusions form as the mind scrambles to explain why the world feels so charged. But dopamine is not the only chemical voice in this story. The glutamate hypothesis, energized by observations that PCP and ketamine can induce psychosis-like states, pointed toward NMDA receptor hypofunction. Researchers argued that impaired glutamatergic signaling, particularly affecting inhibitory interneurons, could cascade into cortical disinhibition and downstream dopamine changes. The brain's balance between excitation and inhibition, between glutamate and GABA, began to look fragile. Post-mortem findings and circuit models implicated inhibitory interneurons, including parvalbumin-expressing cells, suggesting that the architecture of cortical timing and synchrony might be disrupted. In plain language, the orchestra is not missing a single instrument. It has lost its conductor. All of this fit naturally into a neurodevelopmental frame. Schizophrenia often appears in late adolescence or early adulthood, but evidence suggests vulnerabilities can begin much earlier. Subtle cognitive or social differences sometimes precede frank psychosis by years. Epidemiological studies linked prenatal and perinatal factors to elevated risk, maternal infection in certain contexts, famine exposure as in the Dutch hunger winter cohort, obstetric complications. These associations are not destiny, they are risk markers that sketch the outlines of vulnerability. Adolescence, with its neural remodeling and synaptic pruning, sits at the center of this model like a storm season. In 1992, Erwin Feinberg popularized a poignant idea. Perhaps excessive synaptic pruning during adolescence could contribute normal refinement exaggerated into loss, shaving away connections until thought itself thins. Then environmental exposures entered the stage with sharper clarity. Cannabis use, especially heavy use and high-potency products, has been repeatedly associated with increased risk of psychosis in longitudinal research. The details are contested, the causal pathways debated, but the association has proven stubborn enough to matter clinically. Headlines often oversimplified it into panic, but the more careful reading is interaction. Cannabis as a precipitating factor in vulnerable brains, not a universal cause. The idea of gene-environment interplay became the field's recurring refrain. Some early candidate gene interaction claims became famous and then proved difficult to replicate consistently, teaching a familiar lesson about scientific appetite. We love clean stories, even when biology refuses to provide them. The deeper truth is that risk is layered and conditional. Genes tilt the field. Development sets timing. Environment supplies triggers, stressors, and buffers. Urbanicity, migration stress, childhood adversity, and substance use correlate with elevated risk across many studies. Twin research shows the same environment can yield different outcomes even within one family. Causality here is not a straight arrow, it's choreography. For all this progress, clinical translation has been modest. Biomarkers, genetic, imaging, molecular, have not delivered a bedside oracle. MRI differences are group-level effects, not diagnostic signatures for an individual. Polygenic scores are probabilities, not verdicts. High-risk clinics, CHR, UHR, ARMS can identify young people with attenuated symptoms who need support and close monitoring. Yet many individuals in these categories do not convert to diagnosable psychosis within a few years, and conversion rates have shifted across cohorts as referral patterns and early supports change. The gulf remains wide between understanding mechanisms at a population level and predicting or preventing illness in one life. This is a frontier of both promise and humility. Our tools, formidable as they are, still listen with partial ears. And if genes and neurons form one half of the modern story, the other half is quieter and more practical. Social treatment, psychosocial repair, the rebuilding of roofs and routines after biochemical storms. As asylums retreated in many countries, community care did not automatically become humane care. Clinicians and social workers began asking a less glamorous but more useful question. What supports allow a person living with psychosis to hold a job, stay housed, rebuild relationships, and find purpose? One answer emerged through adapted psychotherapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, developed and tested especially in the UK and elsewhere, offered tools for coping with hallucinations and delusions, reducing distress and rigid conviction rather than promising magic erasure. Trials showed modest benefits, particularly when offered early and flexibly. In the UK, NICE guidelines recommended CBT for psychosis and family interventions, a rare alignment of evidence and policy in the psychosocial domain. Family work grew from a blunt observation. Relapse is not only chemical. Household atmosphere matters. Research into expressed emotion, criticism, hostility, over-involvement showed associations with relapse, leading to family psychoeducation models designed to reduce conflict and increase support. The lesson was unromantic and profound. When care excludes families entirely, it often discards one of the strongest resources a person may have. Employment supports changed the stakes. IPS models showed again and again. That rapid placement into competitive employment with on-the-job support outperforms sheltered, train-first approaches. Social inclusion is not merely kind, it is clinically meaningful. Psychosocial rehabilitation and skills training taught the concrete, mundane competencies that make life possible: communication, problem-solving, money management, daily routine. Clubhouse models like Fountain House offered community and membership, treating people as participants rather than permanent patients. Alongside professional interventions, lived experience movements reshaped the moral center of care. Survivor and consumer advocacy insisted that people diagnosed with severe mental illness are not passive subjects, but actors with rights and knowledge. Peer support, once fringe, became increasingly integrated into services. The Hearing Voices movement created spaces where voice hearers could share strategies and meaning without immediate pressure to eradicate experience, reframing symptoms as human phenomena to be understood. The recovery model, articulated in policy and practice, shifted the metric. Recovery was not only symptom reduction, it was the rebuilding of identity, purpose, role, and connection. Not a neat hero's arc, a messy reclaiming. Culture, meanwhile, continued to write its own script for the public. Films and news outlets often preferred drama, and after high-profile violence, mental illness was frequently invoked as explanation. The stigma fed itself. Epidemiology repeatedly shows that most people with schizophrenia are not violent and are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. Yet public imagination clings to the fear story because fear sells. International research complicated Western assumptions further. Chew's studies famously suggested that outcomes in some low and middle-income settings were, on average, better than in industrialized nations' findings that sparked fierce debate about methodology and meaning, but still forced a central recognition. Prognosis is not purely biological. It is embedded in social fabric, family structures, expectations, and acceptance. Anthropology added texture too, showing that psychosis expresses itself through cultural language. Voices interpreted as ancestors or spirits in some settings, as persecutors in others, changing distress and response. None of this means psychosis is easy anywhere. It means experience is both universal and culturally shaped, and care must be humble enough to meet people in their world, not only in ours. So we arrive in the present with a mixed inheritance. Powerful lab tools that reveal patterns, but not destiny. Psychosocial methods that restore life in small, reliable steps. And a contested public arena where stigma, policy, and representation can either shelter or sabotage recovery. The future, if we're honest, will be less about a single breakthrough and more about integration biology informing treatment, psychosocial support scaled and personalized, lived experience guiding priorities, and public policy built sturdy enough to hold people upright. In the quiet fold between midnight and morning, science and story meet. Genes whisper, circuits misfire, but people remain the essential interpreters of meaning. And that brings us to the next, darker strand in this history: the chain of custody, coercion, and the political uses of psychiatry. How keys, laws, and ideologies wrap themselves around the diagnosis. The chain that bound minds began in many places with keys and ledger books, with polite phrases like public order and care, and with the quiet social agreement that certain people could be removed from view. In 17th and 18th century Europe, the habit of gathering the mad, the vagrant, the epileptic, the poor, the old, and the inconvenient into institutions, what Michel Foucault would later frame as the Great Confinement, could look sanitary and moral to magistrates and merchants. A city that feared disorder often found comfort in walls. A parish that feared scandal found comfort in custody. The reasoning was rarely stated as cruelty, it was stated as management. London's Bethlehem Hospital Bedlam became not only a place but a symbol. Iron keys clinking like punctuation against winter stone, rows of beds, petitions written in cramped hands, and the clatter of coins. Across the Channel, Pinel and Tuke performed humane revolutions, unchaining bodies, planting gardens, building routines meant to restore rather than punish. For a time, the language softened, but institutions are machines that run on scale and money. Compassion thins when budgets tighten and populations surge. By the 19th century, in many places, moral treatment had been diluted into warehousing. Rooms filled. People became statistics. Statistics became a rationale for more control. Under those same roofs, new treatments arrived, sometimes as genuine attempts at relief, sometimes as more efficient methods of restraint. Insulin comas, convulsions, electricity, surgery, padded rooms, locked doors that replaced chains. Each innovation had advocates and casualties. The fact that medicine could name a method never guaranteed the method was moral. Sometimes it did the opposite. It gave harm a scientific accent. The early 20th century carried an uglier conviction, one that reached beyond custody and into bloodlines. Some minds were not merely ill, but unfit, not only for community life, but for reproduction. Eugenics swept across industrialized nations like an apparently rational storm. In the United States, from the 1910s through mid-century, state sterilization laws stripped reproductive autonomy from tens of thousands deemed feeble-minded or otherwise defective. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Buck v. Bell Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes's cold sentence, sanctioned such laws with a phrase that still chills the page: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Canada, Sweden, and other countries implemented their own sterilization programs. Sweden's persisted well into the 20th century and would not be fully acknowledged and apologized for until decades later. The logic was tidy in the way bureaucratic cruelty always is. Remove bad genes, protect the public purse, improve the population. The human cost was treated as acceptable collateral, often hidden behind medical paperwork and administrative routine. When National Socialism rose in Germany, that logic was weaponized with terrifying efficiency. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring in 1933 authorized mass sterilization. Less than a decade later, the state moved from sterilization to killing. Under Action T4, initiated in 1939 and continuing in forms beyond its official end, psychiatric patients and disabled people were murdered in hospitals like Hadamar and Grafeneck. What had been framed as public health became extermination. The path from social hygiene to atrocity was not long. It was tragically smooth-paved with forms, certificates, institutional routines, and the banal civility of clerks who signed death warrants with pens that smelled of ink and office coffee. This is one of history's bitter lessons. Administrative order can be used to commit extraordinary evil without the perpetrators ever needing to see themselves as villains. Totalitarian systems also discovered that psychiatry could be used not only to eliminate the unwanted, but to neutralize dissent. In the Soviet Union, psychiatry became entangled with political control. Concepts like sluggish schizophrenia, associated with Soviet psychiatric authorities such as Andrei Snezhnevsky, were used to label behavior that looked suspiciously like criticism of the state. Forensic institutions, most famously the Serbsky Institute in Moscow, helped certify dissidents as mentally ill and remove them from public life. Names like Vladimir Bukovsky and Semyon Gluzman became rallying points as abuses were exposed. International pressure built. The World Psychiatric Association took the rare step of suspending the Soviet Psychiatric Society in the 1980s, an action that did not instantly dismantle the system, but did make visible an ugly truth. Medicine in the hands of a fearful state can become an arm of repression. And abuse has never been confined to the extremes of ideology. Colonial administrations and unequal societies have repeatedly used psychiatric categories to pathologize resistance, to declare inconvenient beliefs as disease. Forced sterilizations and coercive reproductive policies disproportionately targeted poor and indigenous communities in North America, with formal policies lingering into the 1970s and social practices beyond. The legacy remains alive in testimonies, in ongoing litigation, in the slow and often insufficient language of apology. If the 20th century has a catalogue of coercive horrors, it also birthed a counter-language: rights. The grotesque abuses of Nazi medicine helped catalyze modern research ethics. The Nuremberg Code in 1947 placed informed voluntary consent at the center of human experimentation. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, and in the United States, the Belmont Report in 1979, set out principles: respect for persons, beneficence, justice, that gradually seeped from research into clinical expectations. Clinical care, too, began to absorb safeguards. The logic was slow and uneven, but it moved, that a person could not be treated as a mere object of institutional need, that confinement and intervention required justification and oversight, that the state's duty of care could not become a blank check. Deinstitutionalization, in this light, was presented as liberation, move away from custodial hospitals and into community care. In the US, the Community Mental Health Act of 1963 imagined a nationwide network of local services. In Italy, Basaglia's movement pushed toward dismantling the asylum. In Britain and elsewhere, care in the community became policy language. But as we've said before, because it keeps proving itself, closing wards is not the same thing as building ethical care. Community without resources can become abandonment. The gaps were filled by homelessness, by emergency rooms, by jails. Law tried to shape limits in the midst of that messy shift. In the United States, O'Connor versus Donaldson, 1975, established that a state cannot confine a non-dangerous person capable of living safely in freedom. In California, Tarasov, mid-1970s, complicated clinical duties by imposing a duty to warn or protect when credible threats exist. In Europe, human rights jurisprudence tightened standards for psychiatric detention, requiring medical justification and periodic review. Yet law can only outline the boundaries of an ethical problem it cannot solve. When a mind fractures, who decides, and by what standards, whether to intervene? What counts as decision-making capacity? How do you weigh autonomy against imminent risk? Who protects the person from the system that claims to protect them? These questions do not resolve into comfortable answers. They generate the modern debate over coercion, civil commitment, forced hospitalization, involuntary medication, and court-ordered outpatient treatment. Supporters point to crises averted, lives stabilized, suicides and violence prevented. Critics point to trauma, distrust, the corrosion of therapeutic relationships, and the ease with which non-compliance can be interpreted as pathology rather than agency. In England and Wales, legal frameworks like the Mental Capacity Act, 2005, attempted to formalize assessments and safeguards for people lacking capacity, emphasizing least restrictive options and best interests. Other jurisdictions built review boards and formal processes. And still, emergency powers remain because risk does not wait for committee meetings. Out of this contested terrain rose patient rights and survivor movements. People with lived experience, families and allies insisting on voice, on consent, on dignity as something more than a slogan. In the United States, works like Judy Chamberlain's On Our Own helped articulate a consumer survivor movement. Psychiatric advance directives emerged, documents allowing people to state preferences for treatment before crisis. Supported decision-making models grew, challenging older guardianship frameworks. Globally, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, 2006, pushed disability rights into psychiatric ethics, emphasizing legal capacity and challenging routine coercion. Meanwhile, psychiatry faced renewed critique from within and without. Anti-psychiatry currents from the 1960s onward questioned diagnosis as social control. Foucault traced confinement as a tool of exclusion. Rosenhan attacked reliability. And in response, psychiatry attempted to shore up legitimacy through standardization. DSM-III in 1980 was one such attempt. Operational criteria, field trials, reliability. But critics pointed out a truth that remains. Reliability is not validity. Standardization does not prove a category is a natural kind. It can simply make bureaucracy smoother. The biomedical and pharmaceutical era added its own ethical heat. The pharmaceutical industry, energized by the antipsychotic revolution and later the atypical wave, invested heavily in psychiatry funding trials, shaping continuing education, influencing research agendas. The relationship produced medicines that help many people reduce psychosis and live more stable lives. It also produced conflicts of interest, promotional practices, and scandals cases where harms were downplayed and benefits oversold, where off-label marketing bent clinical culture. Public suspicion grew in the wake of litigation and settlements. A hard question hung in the air: was psychiatry serving patients or serving markets? The honest answer, as always, is braided. Both, and the braid changed by institution, by decade, by clinician, by patient. At the same time, evidence accumulated that diagnosis and coercion were not evenly distributed across society. Race, class, and power shaped who was labeled, who was detained, who was believed. In the UK, Black Caribbean and Black African communities have been disproportionately subjected to compulsory detention under the Mental Health Act. In the United States, Black men have historically been more likely to receive a schizophrenia diagnosis than white counterparts. Disparities not fully explained by disease prevalence. Bias, policing practices, unequal access to early care, and social stressors all contribute. Gendered histories matter too. Older pathologizing labels, reproductive coercion, and social punishment disguised as medicine. These patterns do not allow psychiatry the fantasy of neutrality. Diagnostic categories sit inside unequal social structures. They do not float above them like harmless clouds. Science has complicated classification rather than settling it. Genetics has shown polygenic risk. Imaging consortia have shown heterogeneous brain differences. Studies implicating immune pathways and synaptic pruning mechanisms like findings related to complement component C4 offer plausible developmental stories, but still not a simple clinical test. Many clinicians now speak of schizophrenia as a syndrome, a final common pathway for multiple trajectories. That pluralism has opened space for alternative frameworks, trauma-informed approaches emphasizing childhood adversity, social defeat hypotheses emphasizing chronic exclusion in migrants and marginalized groups, early intervention paradigms that seek to reduce the duration of untreated psychosis and improve long-term functioning. But these advances raise their own ethical problems. If you identify someone as high risk, what then? How do you avoid labeling young people with a condition they might never develop? How do you intervene without doing harm, without premature medication, without stigma that becomes self-fulfilling? Some programs have tried alternative organizational logics rather than sharper diagnostic knives. Lauren Mosher's Soteria project offered low-pressure residential support with minimal medication. Open Dialogue in Finland centered immediate network meetings and shared decision-making. Evidence debates continue selection bias, implementation fidelity, generalizability, but the moral provocation remains important. Maybe outcomes are shaped not only by molecules, but by how we organize care. By the 21st century, psychiatry found itself at an ethical crossroads again. This time under the banner of precision. Polygenic risk scores promise stratification. Biomarkers promise subtypes. Machine learning on speech, sleep, phone use, and movement patterns promises early warning of relapse. Digital phenotyping can detect shifts in routine that correlate with crisis days or weeks in advance. And the promise is real. Early warning can prevent collapse. Timely support can avert hospitalization, but the danger is equally real: surveillance, data misuse, algorithmic bias, insurance discrimination, employers peeking into risk, law enforcement weaponizing risk scores, caregivers monitoring without consent. The same tools that could protect autonomy could be used to erode it. The future, then, will not be decided only by science. It will be decided by regulation, ethics, and political will. Who owns data? Who can access it? How consent is obtained? How bias is audited? How protections are enforced? Biological innovation continues. New pharmacology, targeting glutamate pathways, TAR1 agonists designed to reduce psychosis without the burdens of D2 blockade. Immune-focused trials for subsets of psychosis with inflammatory signals, careful work distinguishing primary psychiatric illness from autoimmune encephalitis and other treatable medical causes. Neuromodulation advances, rTMS, for auditory hallucinations. Experimental DBS, refined ECT practice under strict consent and safety standards. None of it will matter without social infrastructure. Housing. First, supported employment, early intervention teams, crisis diversion programs, trauma-informed care. These are not extras. They are the scaffolding that determines whether a person's life becomes livable. The life expectancy gap for people with severe psychosis, often a decade or more, reflects not only biology but poverty, smoking, metabolic side effects, unequal medical care, and the violence of neglect. The quiet lesson of this whole history is operational, not sentimental. Replace secrecy with transparency. Replace warehousing with well-resourced community networks. Replace paternalism with consent and supported decision-making. Train clinicians in ethics and cultural humility, not only pharmacology. Measure outcomes that matter to people: work, relationships, autonomy, physical health, belonging. And central to that is the shift from doing things to patients to doing things with people who have lived experience. Co-production changes priorities. Peer-led services change trust. Survivor knowledge changes what success means. A person can be symptom-reduced and still socially exiled. A person can still hear voices and yet live a meaningful life with supports that respect identity. So the future of schizophrenia care is not one invention away. It is one system away, built slowly, funded honestly, governed ethically. And that, at the Forbidden Dispensary, is where we leave the light on. Not on the easy headline, not on the fear story, but on the stubborn human truth that progress without humility becomes another form of harm. So we go forward carrying two contradictory weights: the hunger to predict and prevent, and the obligation to remember what prediction and prevention have been used for in the past. That's the shadow that falls across every modern promise of precision psychiatry. Because the same century that taught us how to stabilize psychosis with medication also taught us how quickly medicine can become an instrument of discipline. The same administrative talent that can coordinate early intervention teams can also coordinate coerced detention. The same data science that can identify relapse risk can also be used to identify unacceptable people. If you want to understand where we are now, it helps to see our present moment as a collision of three forces. First, biology, genetics, neurotransmitters, immune pathways, brain development, circuit-level models of prediction and salience. Second, systems insurance, managed care, housing policy, criminal justice, disability law, workforce shortages, funding cycles. Third, meaning culture, religion, family narrative, stigma, identity, and the lived experience of what it feels like when reality becomes unreliable. Modern care succeeds only when it takes all three seriously. Precision psychiatry at its best is not a fantasy of a single blood test. It's a promise of better matching, the right support for the right person at the right time, with fewer side effects, fewer traumas, fewer wasted years. But precision is not a synonym for certainty. It is a synonym for probability, and probability is a dangerous thing when societies are tempted to treat it as destiny. Consider the new infrastructures taking shape in the 2020s. Genomics offers polygenic risk scores that can stratify populations for research. Clinicians are tempted to imagine screening programs. The ethical question arrives immediately. If you identify a teenager as high risk, what do you do? Monitor, medicate, label, reassure? And who gets screened? Only those with access to high-quality care, or everyone, including those already over-policed and underprotected? A risk score doesn't arrive in a moral vacuum. It lands in a world with unequal schools, unequal neighborhoods, unequal policing, unequal access to clinics. The same number that might guide supportive services in one context could become a mark of suspicion in another. Imaging and other biomarkers offer group-level patterns. Machine learning models can classify cohorts with impressive accuracy on paper, but a model that performs well in a research dataset can fail in real-life clinics, where comorbidity, medication history, trauma, substance use, and messy human variability blur every clean line. Worse, a model can work on average and still harm individuals if used as a gatekeeping tool. Digital phenotyping, sleep tracking, movement patterns, phone usage, speech analysis promises early warning. It's not science fiction to imagine a system detecting reduced sleep and increased nighttime activity, then flagging an elevated relapse risk. Used with consent, this could trigger a supportive call, a medication adjustment, a crisis plan enacted before catastrophe. But imagine it without consent, or imagine it in a health system where insurers want risk management, where employers want reliability, where courts want public safety. Imagine a surveillance pipeline that quietly turns people with psychosis into monitored subjects. The line between care and control becomes thin enough to cut skin. So the next era demands something psychiatry has historically struggled with: boundaries. Clear rules about data ownership, strict limits on secondary use, consent that is real, revocable, and understandable, independent oversight, auditing for bias, penalties for misuse, a rights-based framework sturdy enough to resist institutional convenience. The same is true for pharmacology. The future of antipsychotics is not dead, but it is constrained by lived reality. Too many people experience side effects that limit adherence, health, and quality of life. The desire for medications that treat psychosis without metabolic harm, sedation, or movement disorders is not cosmetic. It is survival. Research into glutamatergic mechanisms, trace amine-associated receptor targets, inflammatory pathways, and synaptic plasticity is partly driven by this. The recognition that dopamine blockade is useful but incomplete. For many, it reduces voices and delusions, but leaves negative symptoms and cognitive impairment largely untouched. And even when medication works well, it does not create meaning. It does not create housing. It does not create friendship. It does not protect a person from stigma, poverty, or incarceration. Which brings us back to systems, the part of the story that is always less glamorous than a new molecule and far more determinative of outcomes. A person can survive psychosis and still be destroyed by bureaucracy. Insurance interruptions, missed appointments because the bus route doesn't reach the clinic. A landlord who refuses to rent to someone with a psychiatric history. A job application quietly discarded. A medication copay that forces a choice between treatment and food. An emergency response that arrives in uniform with handcuffs instead of clinicians with a crisis plan. If you want to know why schizophrenia outcomes remain uneven, look at those everyday details. Look at the seams where policy meets a kitchen table. This is why the most reliable breakthroughs of the last few decades have been organizational, not molecular. Early intervention services that reduce duration of untreated psychosis. ACT teams that bring care to people who can't reliably come to clinics. IPS-supported employment that returns people to competitive work with real support. Housing first programs that treat stable housing as a precondition for stability, not a reward for it. Family interventions that reduce relapse by strengthening the closest social network. Peer support that rebuilds trust, reduces isolation, and offers a kind of knowledge clinicians do not possess. These aren't soft add-ons, they are the infrastructure of recovery. But infrastructure requires funding, it requires political commitment, it requires a culture willing to see severe mental illness as a shared responsibility rather than an excuse for exile. And that culture is still contested. Media narratives still swing between pity and panic. After violent incidents, mental illness is used as a shorthand explanation, and policy responses often follow fear rather than data. Stigma persists in employment, housing, dating, and family life. It shapes how early people seek help. It shapes whether they disclose symptoms. It shapes whether they adhere to treatment plans, because shame is a powerful solvent of stability. Anti-stigma campaigns help, but they fight louder machines. Real change often arrives through practical exposure. Employers who work with supported employment programs and see capability, not stereotype. Schools that teach mental health literacy. Communities that house rather than hide. Clinicians who treat people like collaborators instead of cases. Now, if we're honest, one of the hardest ethical tensions will not go away, even in a more perfect future. Coercion. In acute psychosis, some people lose insight and capacity. Some become suicidal. Some become dangerously disorganized. Families call for help, and sometimes there is no gentle, fully consensual way to keep someone alive in a crisis. The question becomes, how do you minimize harm when harm is unavoidable? A rights-based system does not pretend the problem disappears. It insists on safeguards, least restrictive interventions, time limits, independent review, documentation, accountability, and above all, respect. Coercion as a last resort, not as a convenience. It also insists on alternatives that reduce the need for coercion in the first place. Crisis respite houses, mobile crisis teams staffed by clinicians and peers, family-based safety planning, advanced directives that specify preferences in crisis, and housing stability that prevents emergencies from becoming catastrophes. If we could offer one operational moral from this entire history, it would be this. The best way to reduce coercion is to build a system that doesn't wait until someone is drowning. That means earlier engagement, lower barrier access, and services that feel safe enough that people don't avoid them until the last possible moment. It also means justice, because the history we've traced is not only about illness, it's about who gets punished for illness. The overrepresentation of marginalized groups in coercive pathways, detention, forced treatment, incarceration, cannot be explained away as clinical necessity. It reflects structural racism, unequal access to early care, differential policing, and cultural mistrust rooted in real experiences of mistreatment. A future that claims to be scientific but ignores that reality will be both unethical and ineffective. So what does it mean practically to do better? It means designing services with the assumption that people are citizens first, not patients first. It means funding housing and employment supports with the same seriousness we fund medications. It means making physical healthcare diabetes screening, cardiovascular care, smoking cessation part of psychiatric routine. Because the mortality gap is not an acceptable side effect of a diagnosis. It means training clinicians in trauma-informed practice, cultural humility, and shared decision-making. It means treating families as allies when possible, not as intrusions. It means paying peers as professionals, not as symbolic decorations in a brochure. It means using data tools only with consent, transparency, and enforceable protections. And perhaps most important, it means accepting that schizophrenia is not one story. It is many stories that share overlapping motifs. For some, it is episodic and manageable with early care. For others, it is chronic and disabling despite best efforts. For some, voices become quieter. For others, voices remain, but life becomes larger than the voices. For some, medication is a lifeline. For others, medication is a trade stability purchased with sedation, weight gain, or emotional flattening. For some, the best care is a careful blend. Low-dose medication, therapy, family support, work support, housing stability, and peer community. For some, even the best care is not enough, and the work becomes harm reduction, dignity preservation, and the long patience of support. The point is not to sell a triumph. The point is to refuse a caricature. Schizophrenia is not a split personality. It is not a moral failing. It is not a simple chemical imbalance. It is not a single gene. It is not a single brain lesion. It is a convergence of vulnerability and development, stress and meaning, biology and society. And our response to it, our laws, our hospitals, our funding priorities, our culture reveals who we are. Here at the Forbidden Dispensary, we keep returning to this because it's the quiet theme underneath all the noise. Every era builds the care it can imagine. Mesopotamia built rituals and ledgers. Egypt built spells and remedies. Greece built humors and temples. Medieval Europe built monasteries and exorcisms. The Islamic world built hospitals with wards and budgets. The 19th century built asylums with architecture and registries. The 20th century built somatic shocks, then pills, then community systems that were sometimes funded and sometimes abandoned. And now we are building something new if we choose to. We can build systems that treat early psychosis like an emergency of time, not a crime of character. We can build housing and work pathways that restore citizenship. We can build legal protections that treat autonomy as default and coercion as last resort. We can build data science that serves consent instead of surveillance. We can build research agendas that treat lived experience as expertise. Or we can repeat the old pattern, new tools, old power. History does not guarantee improvement. It only offers a warning and a map. So as you drift towards sleep, let that map settle in the back of your mind. The goal is not to memorize dates. The goal is to recognize the shape of the machine and to insist, in every small policy choice and clinical interaction, that the machine serve human life rather than manage it. The mind has always been more than an organ to reset. It is a life to be lived. And if schizophrenia teaches anything across millennia, it is that a life can sometimes be rebuilt, not by a single breakthrough, but by steady care, honest systems, and a culture brave enough to choose gardens over gates.